Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. This will be the second in the series that we've been doing with Peter Moon, and I'm looking forward to further discourse. We've got still a lot to cover in the story of the Hall of Records located in the Buscegi Mountains in Romania. There's a 4-book set out from Skybooks that Peter has put out to cover all the details of this most fascinating story. And so we'll get into it here in just a short bit. Peter, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. And there's still much to talk about, but before we get into the discourse, would you give out your website contact and
Certainly,
and all that, where people go find
the
your books?
website is for books is skybooks.usa.com, skybooks.usa.com. You have to put the USA on the end of Skybooks. That's to purchase books. Informational website, and where you can also access the free video series Time Travel Theory Explained is digitalmontauk.com. digitalmontauk.com.
Excellent. Also, do you have any other books that are in the works now, or any other projects that you will...
I'm working on 2 books right now, which will be initially written. They've already begun, they're in progress, and they will be written chapter by chapter on my subscriber website, which will be released at the end of this month. And that's the 2 books. One is called Stardust and Initiation into Time. It could also be called, if I wished it to call it, would be appropriate, the Time Travel Primer, because it initiates you into time, understanding time from both a quantitative aspect and a qualitative aspect of time. The other book is a book about, has to do with L. Ron Hubbard. And I'm working, been working on that book a while. I've done one book on my experiences with Scientology per se in the Montauk Book of the Dead, but this book is going to go into, it's going to evaluate him in terms of the lowest common denominator of power. It's not really about, is he good, is he bad, is what he had to offer good or bad. It's about the lowest common denominator of power and how people can empower themselves. Those are the 2 books I'm working on now.
Interesting. When you say Montauk Book of the Dead, what's that about?
Well, it's good question. I had a lot of synchronicity experiences surrounding got it tied from the Montauk Indians. It was about the olive. I was given a strange, what I call a quantum relic, which was basically a playbill from the new Montauk Theater. And Aleister Crowley's high priestess was actually performing at the new Montauk Theater. I didn't figure that out till later, and I was given this playbill of it. And it took me a year to find out that inside of this, there was 2 pictures of Jesus on the Mount of Olives. So I said, what the hell is this? And I did had a whole bunch of experiences of synchronicity with olives and the Mount of Olives as well. And in the midst of this research, I called a woman named Olive Farrow, who was the matriarch of the Montauk Indians. Of course, there were pyramids where the Montauk Project was once held in Montauk. And I sent her my book, Pyramids of Montauk. And she went to the hospital with a bleeding gallbladder on the day she received the book. She never recovered. She died. And I, said, wow. And I'm researching olives. I had this researching the meaning of olives, which is sacred to every religion, but where the Montauk Book of the Dead, fits in was actually, I found out, I'm going in many different directions here, but the olive was the most sacred substance or tree or gift of the gods in ancient Greece. And it was given to mankind by Athena. But I found out that Athena was really, her earlier name was Antonia. And Antonia came from she was a blue queen of Atlantis who settled in the Ahagra region of the Sahara, which is Algeria today. And so this was a whole strain of synchronicities. And I was ready to write this, which was sort of symbolic of all of these synchronicities. And then I realized that I found out during the process of this experience that my parents, they were killed in an automobile accident in 1974. They were killed on the Adobe Los Olivos, the Adobe of the Olive, the Olivos family in California. And they were also buried on that land. They were killed and buried on that land in an automobile crash. And then I kept getting sent back there in my dreams. And I didn't know why. I wasn't dreaming of my parents. I was sent back to the area nearby. And finally, I realized in one of those dreams, I went back to where I had my early experiences in Scientology, out-of-body experiences. They all took place on Olive Drive. So I said, wow, the dreams were telling me I had to write about my Scientology experiences, which I did in the Montauk Book of the Dead. And this is a very long book. So I then had to write another book called the Montauk Book of the Living to explain all about the synchronicity of, Queen Antonia and the olive itself. And they're both, but it was like, I felt that I needed to explain my experiences with the Scientology movement so people could better understand how I got involved in all of this stuff. Because I never could have accomplished what I have without all of the, I guess what you call learning process that occurred there for me, life learning process. So that's what the Montauk Book of the Dead is about.
Okay, excellent. Well,
Long answer.
yeah. Well, since you brought it up, would you mind elaborating just a little bit on your opinions and your relationship with Scientology and some of the facets of what you've learned and also maybe of what they believe?
Well, and I've said this frequently. There are millions of people who've dealt with Scientology on some level, certainly that have studied it, but every one of them has a different opinion. And so to say, it's like, what is Christianity? You have so many different factions of Christianity. Just in terms of denominations. In Scientology, you don't have a lot of different denominations, but you have a lot of different individuals. And each one of them will have their own take. This is natural. This would apply to any subject, actually. But so you can read on the internet and what people say about it that are involved in it. And you can read about people that will say, oh, it's abusive, it's this. It's all in the eye of the beholder. And I can only speak to how I learned it. And I learned it, first off, and it's all important about how you define things. One of the most, and this is a preface to even talking about the subject, because in the subject of semantics and rhetoric, it's how are you defining the terms that you are using? So people, I see all the time, either comedians or critics saying, Scientologists believe this. And first off, belief does not have a place in Scientology. It's not really relevant if you're going to be strictly orthodox about the subject. It is about knowing. But in actual practice, people fake it. They don't know. They believe. They go along. So you're dealing with human fallibility when dealing with the subject. And you're dealing with the subject, of course, as Hubbard would define it, which was called, he had many different definitions for it. One was called knowing how to know, is the procedure of knowing, how do I know to know? How do I know this? Now that's going to be a very subjective process for an individual. It's also like lookingness. Lookingness was just one pure definition. Lookingness, like going out and looking, observation. Now, of course, Scientology is characterized by all sorts of a virtual infinity of different procedures and processes that are run on the mind, and there are many different approaches but basically the goal of it, when used intelligently, was to go into insisted areas of the mind that had literal charge. When I say literal charge, we're talking about emotional charge, but we're also talking about that would be impacted with some form of electromagnetic energy that would discharge on a galvanometer, which they call the e-meter. You'd see the discharge. It would go for wherever it's occurring in the vicinity of the individual, discharge through his skin and react on a meter. And this is most critics of Scientology, or even the Scientologists themselves, are not familiar with the work of Wilhelm Reich, who talked all about the skin, and the skin being a repository of orgone energy or life energy. So so anyway, you go into these insisted areas of charge within the individual, emotional charge, that would almost invariably trace back to something that might amount to like a past life that was holding one down in terms of their emotional responses to situations, to people. Now, all of what I'm saying here has absolutely nothing to do with the politics and or the alleged abuses that are known to occur in and around the subject. So I entered it at a time when you always heard about abuses. I would see, and sometimes it's not abuse per se, but it's misapplication of the procedures. And I went to, I was indoctrinated to look up every word in every course that I studied. So I really had a certainty and a command of what the hell I was doing. And this gave me a very, I guess what I call superior understanding of the subject. So when I see people saying this about it or that about it, and I'm not trying to tell anybody that it's the correct way to do things or it's for them. I'm just saying what I experienced, and I may not publicly reject what these people say because I don't have the time to waste, but they basically are offering their opinions. It's sort of like a boxer who gets beaten up and says, well, that, the rope-a-dope technique doesn't work, but he didn't know how to use the rope-a-dope technique. It didn't work for him. So, but this is a very booby-trapped subject. And, but I had experiences there. I was involved in the movement for 12 years, and from the ages of 18 to the age of 30, and then I was done with it forever. So that was like my formative years, and I must have studied 12,000 hours on the subject. And this is a discipline study. This is not breezy reading.
Did you what was there any particular reason as to why you left, or just
Yes.
decided to move on to anything
Well,
else?
one of the things is it began to choke off life. The movement itself began to choke life. And one of the things I had learned was to accept life. And this was a problem. And there was a whole bunch of an attempted reform movement. And it took me 30 years to find out what that Hubbard was actually on board for some of the negative stuff that took place. But I'm still not sure that it wasn't because he was misinformed. So there's a lot of things that haven't been, totally expressed as to what went on. I just knew that what was coming down the pike was, and the way people were being treated. And I actually had a sort of a carte blanche from a technical ecclesiastical position to overrule people. I could overrule people, but when it gets to certain areas of politics, it didn't matter. When you have people giving orders that really don't know what they're talking about, and they're untouchable because they don't have names, and they're communicating from some unknown place in the desert. And because I was in Florida at the center there, which was a headquarters of its own. But so in other words, you see that politics had entered it in a way that was, they were going on a long path of embarrassment, which is unraveled into a completely negative situation. So yes, there were, and I explain it in the book. There's, it's like every chapter could be a whole show practically on certain subjects. It's a fascinating subject, but it's like, you can't, like I spent, the time I spent studying it was like far more than say a medical doctor would study to get his license, or a psychiatrist would study. The amount of time, hours spent, was just phenomenal amount of hours spent. And I don't regret any of it, because you learned a lot about people, how the human mind works, how organizations work. And certainly I was always interested in Hubbard and how he worked.
Well, let me just ask you one last thing in regard to Scientology, because my only connection with it is I had gone down to Clearwater, Florida, and I was involved in a protest surrounding Terry Schiavo. I don't know if you know of
Yeah, I
her.
remember who she was.
Yeah. Well, while I was down there, I was interviewing some people, and they had told me to look into Scientology and its connections to, well, the way that its belief on people with disabilities, and how some of the books, or some of the things that Elron had published about people with disabilities, seems to that they supported a euthanasia agenda for, I guess, people of a low scale, or on the tone scale, or
I know
something like
nothing
that.
about that. Certainly euthanasia was never advocated when I was there. Scientologists always tried to, and Hubbard himself, he says, let's put the accent on ability. Let's not pander to people's disability. Let's not pander to it. But no, I never heard of euthanasia being advocated. But maybe somebody does. I don't know. Not when I was there.
Okay, right on. One last thing. Can you expound anything on the connections with some of the higher teachings and the ancient aliens?
Well, Ancient Aliens is, I find, a very suspect subject personally. I don't like it all the way back from Aaron von Däniken. Not that I'm in denial of Ancient Aliens being. It's like this whole television show.
Uh-huh.
I can't tell you how it misdirects people.
I agree.
But so it's like, it's just not one of my favorite subjects. But when you talk about, Scientology, Hubbard wrote this book, which has been held up to understandable ridicule, called The History of Man, which talks about all sorts of wild and wacky experiences on on the whole track, like including, people. But basically, he called this book originally "What to Audit." It was to put into your mind genetic memories. So, or not to put into them, but to give you an idea of genetic memories, so that you could go back in your past life or in your visualization. You could call it a visualization if you want, and go back if you had a toothache or an ache in the mouth, and go back visualizing yourself being a clam or something like this. Or if you had a sore jaw, and you could go back and audit out or run out the experience of a clam having jaw issues or jaw cramping issues or something like this, and you could actually go back and relieve a situation in your own body. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that is really wild and wacky. And I say wild and wacky, it's off the wall for the average person. But what it did serve to do was help stir up your imagination. And people don't realize this about some of the early works. He was really trying to stir people's imagination so they could go into their minds and basically run out impediments, which he called engrams. He called them impediments in the beginning, and then he changed the name to engram, which was a moment of pain and unconsciousness that was emulating from the DNA. And the DNA had say, when somebody is injured, like the DNA responds. So the whole idea of auditing somebody, which basically means to listen to them, is to go back and get that DNA back in communication with the injury and get it to let go of the injury and not respond to the injury as an injury, so that the DNA is no longer responding to an old injury, but is responding to the present. And this had many, I guess what you'd say, labyrinthine paths through the human mind, through experience. So personally, I was able to relieve myself of psychosomatic situations that I had, in particular, a recurring sore throat. Once I did this, it was like a cascade of life came back into my throat area, and it was a very visual past life, and it was cascaded, and it was just like, wow, I never felt so good in my life. And this made me like this made me like the subject and made me pursue it, because I had a demonstrable result, and that issue never returned. So it was a very pragmatic thing, and then of course there are lots of things that go along with it, and but it could easily sell an individual on the one could experience. What just that alone could sell an individual on the subject. And then you also have people you're working with that are propping the subject up. They're working, in this case, at the mission, and then you have your fellow students and your fellow people that audit with you and you audit them. And there's a group dynamic. And of course, this was not the main thing you were there for, but it was a sort of a support community, which made it easier and desirable to do the subject.
Okay, understand that, but as far as what does L. Ron Hubbard think about the ancient aliens? I mean, you don't have to elaborate, but I just am curious.
Well, I will tell you what he thought, to the best of my ability.
Right.
He thought that this planet was very much an off-the-wall planet that was at the corner, the place in the solar system, or the place in the galaxy where nobody wanted to go. And he said it was a repository for criminals, artists, and managers, where they sent you, and they sent you here because you from a bigger civilization, because you were undesirable. And that furthermore, the whole system, like what we would call, or what people would refer to the Illuminati as, this conspiratorial body, Hubbard thought of this local region of the galaxy being controlled by about 8 people that had supernatural abilities, but they were controlling everything, and that they would implant people regularly. Like after you would live so many lifetimes. After every 10 lifetimes or so, you'd report back to an implant station, and they'd make sure that your implants were in instead, and that you would then or be reimplanted and go back and live another 10 lifetimes to keep you under control. Scientologists believe this. The people are continually under sort of a 1984 world in this galaxy/universe. So when you get back to, now this goes back into his cosmology way before what you would call time, scientific references to time would exist. And it would go way back to ancient civilizations where they were just implanting people wholesale. And so, rather than to look at, like, I don't know, the ancient alien type shows, they're kind of trying to show evidence that aliens were here. They're not really dealing with a real culture because the access is rather limited. But Hubbard would tell you that the culture of aliens had to deal with implanting. It is basically implanting to make people forget. And I think there's certainly a degree of truth in it. He might have focused too much on it, but then again, if he did, it's understandable because implants aren't focused enough in our world today. In fact, implant is now a standard word when we think in terms of alien abductions or mind control programming. Back in the 50s, no, they didn't really talk about implants. He was like, he had figured this out or accessed it from his dealings with the military. And he was talking about electronics being used to control spiritual beings. This is going back into the early 50s. So, and electronics were part of this implant procedure. So that would be his take on ancient aliens in a nutshell.
Okay, great. Well, we're almost at first break, and well, we'll pick it up on the other side. Be right back,
Okay.
everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody. I want to ask you this question, and this will lead us into the discussion for the topic for the evening. What's your take on the Illuminati, and as far as this group of individuals working behind the scenes to lead us to New World Order?
Well, again, a lot of it is, I just read something very interesting, and I think it was by Anton LaVey. I read a quote by Anton LaVey. Of course, he was the guy who founded the Church of Satan in San Francisco. And he says, people put all their attention on the eye in the triangle. He said, this is to take your attention off the trapezoid beneath it. And of course, the trapezoid, it's called a trapezoid. It's, in other words, this whole paradigm that's created and fostered by people like Alex Jones and whatnot, it's a polarizing fear sort of thing that doesn't really, I guess what you'd say, dislodge the situation. And it's, so a lot of it is, like, say, when you understand consciousness, we're living in a paradigm where our brains are only using a part. The average person is using, something like 10% of his brain capacity. He's breathing with less than 10% of his lung capacity. So everybody's in sort of a abbreviated state. So and you can blame it on the forces, the control, but in a universe, in a civilization where everybody's operating like with 1/10 capacity, what do you expect? You see, this is the kind of thing. It's sort of like it's lame. So if you have all these people operating at less than full capacity, they're virtually lame. They are indeed lame. And so of course the civilization is lame. And so this explains why we have war, why we have poverty. And then of course it would also suggest that the leaders are lame. So the solution is to occupy. When we had that Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street. Well, the way to occupy, first we have to occupy ourselves, our own brains, our own lungs, and we have to start breathing to full capacity, and we have to start improving our thinking capacity, ideally going to full capacity. So it's like, if you look at the environment we're in, you can't really blame one person. You can't blame a group of people, but you can certainly acknowledge the fact that we have a bunch of lame brains running the show. And that's exactly what happened in Scientology. You had lame brains running the show. To what degree Hubbard became lame or not is arguable. But so anyway, this is the situation we live in. So to villainize these people is very limited. I mean, they may deserve villainization, but it's like, who's going to replace the next one? And that's what I have to say about it.
Okay, well, what about do you think that they are being controlled and that there's a spiritual force like the eye at the top of the Illuminati pyramid? Is that representative of the overseers? And are they like how a lot of people talk about the reptilians or the dragons, and that there's all this mythology connected to them. Even in the Sumerian mythology, they speak about their attempts to enslave humanity or to create a servant race. What's your take on that? And then we'll go into the
Well,
story.
this serves certain people's mindsets. It is like what people write about and talk about is very reflective of what their mindset is. And now keep in mind, we're dealing with a lame brain culture. So when you see reptoids being exaggerated and amplified, this is in fact sort of what they did at Montauk. They'd amplify things, and they amplify this, and reptilians will generally scare the hell out of people. And in ancient Sumeria, it's very interesting. If you go to Transylvania, near the town of Deva, within 5 minutes or so, there's a little town called Sumera, and this, by their tradition, is where Sumeria came from. Sumeria was named after this. See, in the work of Radu Sinamar, you'll see that Transylvania, I think we discussed this before, was the ancient repository where everybody went during the Ice Age. It was the initial culture to that degree. And when the Ice Age was over, it emerged. So then you had people naming locations after it. Sort of like you have York and then New York, Amsterdam, New Amsterdam. So the ancient culture of Transylvania or Romania was the dragon. And you will see that there's even the way the mountains are shaped look like a dragon, and they correspond to the constellation Draco. But they have white dragons and black dragons, and dragons are not considered negative. It's just like yin and yang. There's white dragons and there's black dragons, so to speak. And and this is where Chinese culture, who reveres the dragon, gets their dragons from. But see, and then of course, dragon is a whole way of thinking and what's the word I'm trying to say? It goes very deeply into qigong, where one has the certain dragon energy, the dragon breath, the dragon body. The dragon body is completely uniting your body, mind, and soul to the point where you can do incredible things. It's so anyway. I have a very different perspective of dragon than say some of the isolated cartoon versions of dragons. So certainly there's a negative aspect to dragons indeed, or can be.
Well, what's your take on like the antediluvian age or the prior times, or what the Egyptians reference as Zep Tepe the first times? Um, and if you, in learning whatever, because I know you've been in some very interesting areas of research, in what you've come across and what you've learned from these different individuals that you've interacted with, and also in doing your own studies on ancient mysteries and ancient mythologies. What's your take on the, like, the mother culture, or the motherland, or like Atlantis, Mu, or whatever you want to call it, but like the pre-Adamic age?
Well, as I say, you have to keep in mind that my indoctrination into God in the adult world was through Scientology. And one of the things that was sort of imbibed in you, not forced upon you, but was that this planet, and I'm not saying this is correct, I'm not saying it's incorrect, I've adopted other viewpoints, but this was my orientation, was that this planet and everything on it was just sort of rank and off base, and it was sort of laid on the chain, and then the real ancient history took place somewhere else. Now that was kind of my attitude. So my attitude towards ancient culture, antediluvian periods, and all these things you're talking about, I never had a great deal of interest in, because they were all, from my perspective, were being run by a control faction that was dead set on keeping people limited and stupid. Now, that was my intention. So it's like I've never taken these. The only reason I've even taken on the subject of ancient cultures of all is because of Radu's books, because I published them, I wrote about them, and I've had a chance to experience some of the traditions of this particular country, Romania. So that's kind of where I enter the fold. I've had some knowledge of Egyptian esoteric wisdom, but I'm not the one that's going to go in and look at all this tedious archaeological stuff, because the archaeologists prove time and time again they don't really know anything, and they don't brag to know things. It's a tedious job. They will sensationalize ideas and conclusions and whatnot, but they're not very adept esoterically. It's not really what they're there for. They're there to tediously chronicle and catalog information from artifacts. So that's what I have to say about that. But I do have something important to say with regards to what you said, the Illuminati.
Sure, go right ahead.
The most advanced understanding, and I don't know how easily I can communicate this, is that there's something when you get beyond the third dimension, the fourth dimension, which is basically a series of events. And if you can imagine a series of events like pixels, all on a board. Well, these are all the events that we live through and travel through. And one person going from one pixel to another, that's his timeline. He's going from this event to that event to that event to that event to that event. And this is all in one dimension, which we do not have access to. We're only in one event at a time. In this dimension, we can move from one event to one event. And if we get in a jet airplane, we can move very fast through these events, but it's still one event, one event, one event, one event. When we consider the fifth dimension, it is considered to be all the potential movements we could make going from event A. So we could go from event A to event B, C, D, E, or F. And then all of those different potentials would be a part of the fifth dimension. In other words, every potential parallel universe. These are infinite. That is the fifth dimension, all those potentials. And we say dimension means a measuring stick. So this is a measurement. We say, okay, so if you're at point A and you can go to B to C to D, and then you go off on a different course, well, this has to be accounted for, just in terms of as a potential. So the fifth dimension would contain all of those potentials, and they would be real potentials. They're just not actualized by ourselves because we're living here down here in the third dimension, which can be looked at from the fourth dimension. The fifth dimension, all right, so is all of those potentials. The sixth dimension is the ability to go from any point in the third dimension or the fourth dimension to any point in the fifth dimension, to any potential, or to go back from one point in the fourth dimension to another point in the fourth dimension. You could, this is basically a form of time travel, but we're not talking here about machines or time travel reactors or anything like that. We're talking about spirits. We're talking about spirits, and these spirits have traditionally been identified as angels and or demons. The most, I guess, what you call clinically accurate would be that they're one and the same. One side of the coin is an angel, one side of the coin is a daemon. A daemon basically means of God. So you have these energies, principalities, whatever you want to call them, that have the ability to maneuver from one dimension to another. And what is the controlling modus operandi that those creatures are doing? I only know that when you get into the vicinity of this sixth dimension, and I suppose other semantics could be used, but this is what I've been learning. When you get into that territory yourself and you breach these areas, there is often a recoil of a rather dramatic, if not dangerous, degree. And because these are control zones that you necessarily are pushing the envelope. It's like looking behind the wizard's curtain. And that wizard in the Wizard of Oz was a lot of bluff. He was a lot of bluff. And if he could have slapped the dog back, which he sort of tried to, he would have, but he didn't have security on his curtain. And these the creatures that patrol these areas have much better security. They have much better security. So I've always held to what is a truth in studying esoteric. You are allowed to go where you are allowed to go. In other words, if you have a reason for going there, a valid reason, you'll be allowed to enter. But if you have no reason there, you won't be allowed to enter. So this this is an area of esotericism that, of course, has been. Um, this is the magic. What I'm talking about here directly relates to the magic of John Dee and Edward Kelly, who were basically channeling angels from this realm that were giving them calls to basically control or manipulate circumstances. And these Enochian angels, as they're called, are a very suspicious lot, which I say. Mm-hmm. They can be effective, but they're a very suspicious lot. And this is kind of the paradigm that we all live under. Now, maybe I could describe it better, and maybe I could describe it a lot worse. But this is kind of what, when you strip away all the drama, we're dealing with an area, which I've referred to here as the sixth dimension, which we do not have free, unfettered access to. And I likened it, I used this analogy recently. I don't know if I used it with you. It's like going to a park and you go there to say you're going to do your workout and you're minding your own business, but there are drug dealers in the park, and the drug dealers, they notice that you're there. They may or may not like you there. They may consider you a threat if they're going to be doing deals that you might see. They might not care that you're there, but you certainly see them, and it's not a good vibe. So this is kind of what can happen to individuals when they go into this. And there is a whole tradition in magic, magic with a K, where the actual magicians that can go from one spot to another in this dimension are called leapers. Leapers, because they can go from one to the next.
Concerning the relationship of certain occultic individuals and or even groups, some of the secret societies with some of these particular beings, these interdimensional beings or overseers, whatever you want to call them. Do you think that they are trying to push accessing a certain technology or in understanding certain aspects of the occult to certain individuals or groups um, as part of an agenda to gain access to something or to accomplish some kind of goal? Or what's your thought on that?
Well, see, I think we make a big mistake when we try to put them into our thought frame, because they don't think like we do. And they're like, just somebody, I knew somebody who, he was a very well-researched researcher. I mean, this guy was, he went out to Montauk with me the first time, Howard Metz. He had researched, he was so thorough in his research about, controversial topics. This was back in the 80s, early 90s, when people weren't caught onto this yet. But one of the things he says that the very and we're talking about the wealthy people of the world. He says the very wealthy people of the world, he says they don't think like you and I. He says that, just, people getting killed is nothing to them. It's kind of like you looking at some baseball pitcher who's crying because he just gave up the game losing home run. He goes in the dugout and you see him crying. Okay. You don't really care too much, especially if he was not the one you were rooting for. It's sort of like their regard for people is like people are like cattle. Uh-huh. So this is in the very rich area. But what you're alluding to is something that's even more than the very rich area, because the very rich are stooges for this type of energy that you're talking about. Right. But what is their plan? I think that the plan is, it's kind of like an old game of just remaining dumb. Like, we have the hospitals which are totally bent on money. Everybody's evaluated in terms of money.
Right.
And this is so tragic. And then if we look at it through astrology, well, what is this? This is Scorpio. Scorpio is other people's money. It's control. It's all about control through other people's money. It's also about control through religion and sexuality. But it's basically and it rules the profession of accounting. So you have all these bean counters going up and looking at a hospital. Well, we got to make money. We got to do this. We got to do this. We got to do this. The whole medical profession is based upon money, and this is it's Scorpio is ruling this this profession, and it's crazy.
Hold on, Peter. We'll be right back for second hour, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody, for second hour. Do really want to quickly remind the listening audience that you can gain access to the archives, and because we have both Studio A and Studio B continuously ongoing simultaneously, and there is overlap between the various hosts, the best way to gain access to all the shows is to support freedomslips.com. Go there, click on the donate button, and subscribe to the archives, which is only like $4.95 a month. And in my opinion, it's the best way to be able to access all of the archives for all of the different hosts of all of the different shows on both studios. And you can download these programs, burn them to disk, or put them to your iPad, iPods, and listen to them as you're driving back and forth to work, and utilize that time wisely. But we do have like monthly bills um, that we are needing to pay, and that we have to expand in different ways, and that we just updated to different servers. And those of you that can support our platform and supporting our work, and in basically allowing and assisting all of the different hosts to be able to utilize Revolution Radio as a platform with truth. We do appreciate all of you, and thank you in advance, and appreciate all your support in that way. And even for just the price of a Happy Meal, if each one of us were to support the network in that way, it would take care of itself, no problem. And so those of you can, please do go to freedomslips.com, click on the donate button, and give $5, $10 to help us continue coming to you in the way that we do. Also, one other thing, there you can, if you are interested and you want to support any of the different hosts, you can request a CD, an audio CD that has all of the shows going back to the beginning of last year burned on them. And this is one way that half of the money goes to supporting each one of the different individual hosts. So that's just another way to support the different people that are part of the network, because we're doing this, basically out of the goodness of our heart, and just trying to assist you in making sense of what's going on in the world, and sharing fellowship and learning from one another. It's such a strange world that we live in. Peter, one more time real quick, if you would give out your contact website, where people can go to find your
For
books.
to look at and buy books, it's skybooks.usa.com, skybooks.usa.com. And for information, including the to access the new videos, Time Travel Theory Explained, that's digitalmontauk.com, digitalmontauk.com.
All right. One last question on as far as the Montauk and the connections to what we were talking about with the Illuminati and the overseers, because this is also connected to the story that we've been talking about with Radu, and
Right.
and so if you would, can you just briefly touch upon the connections with both the Illuminati and the reptilian overseers with the Montauk experiments in time, and then let's go into further elaboration on the the
You
Buscegi
sort of
Mountain
threw me.
Sword.
The reptilian overseer is not a paradigm that I understand or buy into. So if you could restate the question.
Sure. Well, just is there some kind of um, was there not some kind of connections to the reptilians with the Montauk experiments? Maybe not overseers or just these beings in general.
Well,
Um,
there were stories of this, but these things are so hard to verify and to put
yeah.
into reality. What is very obvious with the Montauk Project itself is that you had a uh, uh, quantum attractor of consciousness that was trying to literally control time, and that meant an unfettered six-dimensional access, and it was doing it through technology. Okay, and it backed up on the participants. Okay,
Hmm.
it backed up and it turned into a holocaust of sorts. So it was like a project that burned out, short circuited. And as I said, this is what happens when you get into these certain areas.
Hmm.
They burn out. They don't, you're messing with powers. Now, it's been proven in this world that you can get away with a lot. You can be very outrageous in this world and get away with a lot. And this has gone on throughout history on this planet. So, but sometimes when you reach certain areas, you get bit back, and this is what happened at the Montauk Project. When we consider uh, now the story of Radu, when we're going into the mysteries there, and it's particularly in the third book, Mystery of Egypt, where uh, Caesar is going back in time in this time device that's underneath the Giza Plateau, and he's going back in time, and he's trying to access who built this, and he gets blocked. In other words, the people that built it don't want him to see it,
Mm,
or either that, or there are impediments. You know, he's not able to see it. So,
that's interesting.
yeah, there's always like limitations in the paradigm that one is working in. So when it's like the whole culture of ancient uh, Transylvania is based upon initiation in caves. And this goes right into the spirit world. And in here, we don't have such a, I guess what you call polarizing type of reference to, overseers, reptilians or not. You have initiators that would initiate and give mankind the ability, give individual people the ability to be initiated and to transform. Their patron god, Zalmoxes, was indeed one such character who was taken into a cave for 4 years, where he developed into a god, according to tradition. Many hundreds of books written on Zalmoxes in the Romanian language, and they've not been translated into English. But anyway, this is a whole tradition of being initiated in the depths of the inner earth. Now, from this perspective, this is, sort of like recovering the hard disk of your own memory. And the one thing is, we forget. We're walking around thinking that we're individuals, that maybe we're evolving, or maybe we de-evolved, or all this sort of thing. Individual consciousness is really a recession, and it's a receding of a consciousness which burst out of the stars and came here and formed, species, groups, and men developed an individual consciousness, but it's sort of a receding from the whole, to where you're thinking, because life does think, even when it's not in a human form. It's thinking in terms of the whole, the morphogenetic grid. It's thinking as planets form, as life begins to form. There's this unified thinking that takes place in the stream of life. So when you get to the person as an individual, human beings a long time ago didn't think in such individual reference frames. In fact, the tribes would think in terms of the tribe and making the tribe be supported, and people would take on different roles to help the tribe. Where now, in our current situation, it's like everything is so compartmentalized that people they're taking jobs in society to make money, to survive. It's very little of it has to do with keeping the tribe alive, they're trying to fit into the system. They're not trying to keep anybody alive. They're trying to keep themselves alive. So as you begin to evolve into consciousness, you begin to embrace oneness. It's an embracing, so that the ideal human being would be completely flowing with the infinite, in and out. This is like the Christ saying, I am Alpha and Omega, and the beginning and the end. It's like a flowing with that continuous stream of consciousness, as opposed to good guys and bad guys, and this person trying to stop us and that person trying to stop us. And this is what us humans get relegated to when we wake up in this, sort of puzzle universe.
We were talking just really quick about before we came to this last break about where they were trying to lead us, and it seems almost like they're trying to recreate some kind of technology. Do you think that the time travel aspects of that, the overlap in the dimensions, that has something to do with what they are trying to help humanity gain access to? And if that is so, what would be the reasons for that? Because don't you think that there's some kind of personal agenda to it? I mean, they're not doing this just to help us, that they have to have some kind of something involved with, wanting to bring it about in that manner. They've got to have some kind of ulterior motive or interest in it. And what might
Well,
that be?
well, I could say it like this from my own practitioner, as a practitioner of Qigong. I have a tremendous ability to help people. And that help is teaching them the ancient art of Qigong. And it can work miracles in people. I don't talk about it that often, but although I do plan to eventually release some courses on it online. But like say, I'm walking into this area. It's called Prislope Monastery in Transylvania. It was the home of Father Arseny Boca, who was a very famous religious man who predicted all this stuff. It's in one of the books, predicted that Romania would become center stage because of what would happen there. And I visited his grave one August 12th. And there are all these people coming. And I'm walking out of the monastery. And these people go there and you see them, they're limping, they're lame, they're going there to heal, for some miracle healing. And I'm looking at these people and I said, man, I could take them all and I could have them feeling so much better in no time, if they would do what I say. And so in other words, but this is the thing. It is very few who would listen.
Right.
And I don't of course, they spoke a different language. But then there is the occasional person. There's one guy who'll tell you I saved his life because he was diving, he was going down with all sorts of, oh man, it was a bad situation. But he actually did what I told him, which a lot of it had to do with, wiggling his toes. Toe wiggling is a very powerful exercise, and moving the foot back and forth. And this is for a condition that had to do, with circulation, and also walking in a figure eight. But it's like, so when I'm talking about getting back to your question, these people are positioned in the story as evolved beings. There's all states of evolution, and they look at humanity. They can't help but look at humanity much like we would look at monkeys in a cage. Like, you poor stupid monkey, you got trapped. You're in a cage because our species has destroyed so much of your homeland. You're lucky to be getting food for free. So that's how human beings might look at a monkey in a zoo.
Mm-hmm.
They look at us somewhat similar to that. They can't help it because they're looking at these people that are like deficient, as they said, lame. They're breathing with very little breath. They're thinking with very little thought. So they look at this and it's like they could, come out and do a big display and they would be not ignored or not appreciated. And it's sort of like, this is another situation with my friend David Anderson. When he has gone public, the response is so discordant with anything that could be termed progressive. And this is response by individuals who are just stupid. And sometimes they might be being put up to it. But in other words, who has time for that? He's a scientist, And sure, people in your audience would love to hear him. But unfortunately, not everybody. Revolution Radio is only one part of the audience of planet Earth. So, in other words, human beings don't respond well to advances in technology. And often they will respond to it with their own thirst for some sort of power. So it's almost like they begin to echo the overseers, so to speak, in their own mindsets. So basically what I'm saying is these more evolved beings can put open a doorway. They can put open a doorway and say, well, here it is. What are you going to take? What are you going to figure it out? Now, in my experiences with these books, people can read them and they can have their minds broadened. And I downplay that because people, I will discount my own contributions, and people say, oh, you're broadening people's horizons. This is very good. And I'm saying, well, yes, but there are few and far between who will take the journey there. And for me, it's been a very personal journey of an adventure of actually going there and trafficking with the energies that are more, I guess, fundamental than the books themselves. The books are a story, and I'm not saying they're not a true story, but they're a story. Mm-hmm. And they're not, and then there are, I guess, real functionaries, et cetera, behind the experiences. And those are what I've had the opportunity to traffic with. And I mean, even more so than the publisher, the Romanian publisher, because he's not really, participating in these. He's too busy running his company most of the time. So I've had a great opportunity to participate in this sort of thing. So I hope I answered your question. Did I lose you?
I apologize. I had it on mute, but anyways, I'm sorry about that. But anyways, I just really wanted to lead into the story, anyways, to set up the next book. If anything that you'd like to say in relation to Transylvania Sunrise, but I'd like to go ahead and move into the second book in the series, the Transylvania Moonrise, and talk, some of the background
Okay.
of yeah. So if you would,
Did we cover Transylvania Sunrise in our first show? I don't remember because I've done a few
yeah,
shows. Okay.
yeah,
All
yes,
right.
we
So
did.
Transylvania Moonrise is the second book in the series, and uh, okay, so we're left off with Radu having experienced this wonderful facility in the Buscegi or the Buscegi Mountains, and wow, his mind has been kind of like blown away by all of what he's experienced. And this story begins with the publisher, man I was just talking about, Serene Hormuz, receiving a phone call from a man who in the book is described as Eleanor. It's not his real name. And Eleanor says that he would like to meet with Radu, and Radu is not into speaking with the public. And, he says, sorry, I can't help you. But the man calls back. He's very persistent. And finally says, look, and he says, well, what is it that you want? He's so persistent. He says, well, there's a Tibetan Lama that wants to meet him. And so basically he lets Radu know it's a Lama. And Radu was very interested to meet a Lama. Why would a Lama want to meet me? So one evening, an arrangement is made for Radu to go to a home in a new section of Bucharest, very modern homes. I've been there, not to this particular home, but to this section, which I was able to figure out indeed was the neighborhood he talks about in the book. Beautiful homes. Wow. You won't find anything like them in the US, just the way they do the architecture and stuff. But in any case, he goes to this house and he's waiting for the Lama, but he meets this man named Eleanor who comes out and greets him, and he's the owner of the house. And while they're waiting, they have a discussion. And one of the first things they hit upon is that Eleanor has a driver's license which says he's in his 60s, but he looks like he's 26. And what wall is this coming off of? And then Eleanor tells him this elaborate story. And I said this is the first chapter of the book, and it's the best thing I've ever read. It was fantastic to me anyway. That one chapter alone, and I said whatever I paid for the translation, it was worth it alone just to read this one chapter. And basically, he's talking about his youth is through alchemy. And basically, he was initiated into a tradition by an ancestor. And the ancestor goes back into about the 1300s. And he was like, the ancestor was living apparently for some 600 years or something like that. And this particular ancestor had a family, and they were traveling in a caravan. The caravan, as I recall, got raided. And he ended up going to I think a sultan of some sort, and then he was in the service to the sultan, and then a magician from India came there and saw the boy and asked if he could, buy him or whatever, and the sultan just gave him, because the magician had done him many favors, so he took the boy to India, and he initiated the boy in this ancient tradition of alchemy, part of which was building a device that would enable him to stay young through vibration. And Radu was allowed to see either that device or a similar device. And anyway, so this little boy who's grows up, and he accumulates a vast amount of wealth over his very long life. He says he had to move to different areas just to because you can't stay in one area too long if you're remaining internally youth, because people will start to get suspicious and there's too many questions. So basically, this man was looking for one of his own descendants to teach, to hand off this tradition to. And they were very carefully selected. And he found this young Eleanor a possibility. And during communist times, he made contacts. He had his own contacts within communist Romania, and he was able to get to Eleanor. I think Eleanor's family might have been German before they were Romanian, or the ancestors. But so anyway, he was able to get through Eleanor and contact him. Continue the next half hour.
Yeah, hold on. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back, everybody, for final segment. And know also that, especially for those of you that are familiar with the 4-book series on this story, that we will have another 2-hour session next week to cover this in great detail. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Peter, because I know that we're going to quickly run out of time. So we'll cover
Well,
what
yeah,
we
I mean,
can.
this was an interesting show so far because you asked me a lot of my personal opinions and stuff, which isn't usually typical, but that's fine. It's a refreshing, different way. So anyway, as I was talking about this tradition of immortality, as was acquired by this man Eleanor, and he was contacted and by his ancestor, and who began to, write to him by letter and basically clue him in that there's much more that he could do. And he was about to be married to this woman. He had a very good job lined up in communist Romania in the city of Oradea, and which is right on the border with Hungary. But he took the bait. He went for it, and they were able to, through the ancestors' contact in Romania, through the Communist Party or whatever contacts, he was able to smuggle him out of Romania. And it wasn't really smuggling. What he did is he arranged a false documents. They got him false documents as a Belgian diplomat. And because he spoke French, he could get away, which they speak in Belgium. He could get away with it. And the border guard wished him a bon voyage, which was rather amazing. And he got out of communist Romania. He went to France, where the initiation for his own initiation began. So he basically explains that there are, he shows him a device actually, and the device is a geometric device, which is like a rhomboid, part rhomboid, part sphere. I think there's a pyramid in there. Right in the center is a crystal that is turned purple. And he said this is the hardest part of the process, where the initiate has to make his own device, and he actually wills this crystal to become purple. Wills it or affects it. It's a preparation, and this device will keep him young. He needs to keep it within a certain distance of himself. Now, what I'm saying here is very summary. In other words, I'm just saying it very quick. You read the book, it's done in such a way that people don't make stories up this good when you actually read the details of what he is saying. And it's utterly fascinating. The way he says it, the descriptions he goes into, and basically he says that most people who do this process will live for about 300 years, 400 years, and then they will just kind of move on to the next world. They will literally ascend. I don't think that's the word he used, but they no longer have to manifest in a body. But the same body remains existing. And although it's vulnerable to death, just as anybody else would be, but this is what generally would happen after 300 or 400 years. They can live up to thousands upon thousands of years, but it's not necessary because the person can kind of get the hang of. Now, this is going back into the 6th-dimensional reference frame I'm talking about. And the more that I've studied after reading this book, the more this potential is indeed a possibility. It becomes more possible and probable all the time as I continue to get further educated. And I say this with a reference to solid factual experiences or data. Most people are living in some degree of pain or physical dysfunction and really can't always appreciate. They can hope. Some people will easily latch on to hope. But in any case, so he's talking about this incredible tradition of living a long time. Now, as interesting as this is kind of a sidelight to the entire story. But it's the beginning, and it's an important lesson. The book actually doesn't begin there. The book actually begins with a preface and a foreword, and one of which includes a series of articles in the Romanian press that corroborate that the first story did indeed take place. Because you had a lot of people contacted the publisher corroborating that this stuff did happen. So it includes a lot of corroborative articles in the beginning, and then this story about Eleanor. And then, but that's not the whole story in the first chapter, is that Eleanor gets a call on his cell phone, and he says, "Oh, this is the Lama." He apologizes, he's not going to be here till, I guess, about 10 o'clock or something like that. So in the meantime, let the Lama stay away. This is a fascinating lecture or talk. But the Lama does show up, and he has a very curious creature with him. The creature is called a Yidam. Now, you can look up Yidam, and you can find all sorts of, it's a Buddhist reference. But this, and the definition I'm gonna give or description might or might not fit what you might read on the traditional Buddhist renditions of this. However, the Yidam is and this is explained by the Lama to Radu, because he says, first off, I don't want this guy to freak you out. He's about 7 feet tall. He looks like something out of the Arabian Nights, and he's huge. He says, let me explain what this is. So the whole conversation turns to a Yidam and what a Yidam is. He says, a Yidam is created by a Lama. It is an extension of the Lama. This is not his personal Yidam. It is obviously the...
All right. Yep. We are back connected. I apologize, everybody. The Skype reset and the server dropped. So I have Peter on again with me. And I believe that the last that I heard was that we were speaking about the Yidam. So if you would just pick
Well,
up
we were speaking about the Yidam, but I've said quite a bit about the Yidam, so I don't know.
Well, they probably did hear you. So just pick up where you last remember, wherever
Okay.
we got
All right.
disconnected.
Well, anyway, I was saying that the Yidam, that they could teach a Yidam to talk, but it took a lot of work and took a lot of effort, and that this particular Yidam, and that he introduced the Yidam to Radu this evening because they were going to be going on a trip, and Radu was surprised to hear a trip. What trip? And the Yidam is going to be necessary on that trip, so he doesn't want to surprise him later. He wants to acclimate him to the Yidam. And then the Lama identifies himself as Dr. Zien, the character who appeared as the one who created Department Zero from, he created Department Zero on behalf of representing the Chinese government. So he explains that he was a character in the court of the Dalai Lama in the 50s, and that when the communists came in to invade Tibet, he left, and he ended up working in the employ of the Chinese, which is a tricky business. And he said he had friends in governments all over the world. You know, he's got his own special connections, and he's very secretive and slips in and slips out when he wants to. But now he was appearing to Radu as a lama and not as a doctor, as he had appeared to Caesar in the first book. So he appeared, he says this, so basically he says, we're going to be going on a trip to Transylvania. And so he gives Radu 4 days to, you know, get his affairs in order. And then they get in the SUV, the Lama and Eleanor's SUV and Radu, and they drive up to Transylvania, which is not a short drive. Anyway, when they get up there, they meet up with the Yidam. And basically what occurs there is a space translation. And it's very well described. It's kind of like, you know, Radu sees space kind of like changing the sky, and it's all kind of folding and unfolding upon itself. And this space translation, which is not a time translation, they are, and it occurs in the presence of the Yidam. I'm not real sure whether it was the Yidam's doing or the Lamas or both. But in any case, who facilitated it? But when they get to, they actually end up in the mountains of Tibet, and they're in a very high area that is inaccessible by car or plane. And the Yidam is actually able to provide temperature control. That's one of the reasons he's there, is to make the temperature controlled, and so that they can survive in this environment. They come to a cave. The Yidam and the Lama go inside the cave. Then they come out, and Radu is talking to Eleanor outside the cave, and then Radu is allowed to go in the cave. And when he goes in there, he sees this beautiful blue goddess. Her name is Mashande. And she's gorgeous. She's very dignified. And she basically greets Radu, and she has a mission for him. And she, I mean, there is some talk between the two. And of course, he's kind of like awestruck by this presence. And she played a role in ancient history. She was the devotee of a character in the Bhagavad Gita called Sita, which was the wife of Rama. And we later learned that these events took place in the land known as Romania today. And this is substantiated by all of the flora and fauna that are described in the Bhagavad Gita, which don't necessarily exist in the Indian region. So Rama was a character of this part of Transylvania where they had actually did a space translation from. And basically, she gives Radu a scroll, a parchment. And this parchment becomes the fourth book in the series, the Secret Parchment. It's not mentioned in, well, it is mentioned in the third book, but this parchment is what is called in ancient Buddhism, and even the earlier traditions, is a terma. And a terma is, they were buried by the ancient, he was called the second Buddha, Rinpoche, who sort of founded Tibetan Buddhism. And he left all of these termas around. in different places, and they would be dug up at specific time in the history of the world. So when we go back to what you were saying about the overseers, this is kind of a long, old agenda. And so all of this literature that is coming out, and then there is a person who is supposed to take the terma and basically find it and give it to the world. And this is the Tertan. This is Radu. So the Tertan is, obviously an important character. Now, I'm not the Tertan in this case, but I am the conveyor of the Tertan by publishing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this, and I will tell you that, and this is how serious the Buddhists consider this. One of my friends who went to Romania, he took me to meet the Buddha, not the Buddha, the Lama in Woodstock. It was his 93rd birthday. And there were like thousands of people there to honor his birthday. There were over 300 waiting in line to see him. And I was taken right in. And the guy was surprised at how much time he spent with me, about at least 20, 25 minutes. Just tell him all about David Anderson and tell him this. And it was kind of fun. I mean, because it was this connection, this connectivity to this tradition that was sort of my open door into there. Mm-hmm. There was also a practical side, is that my friend did have access, but still, they had people out there waiting to get him gifts. I don't even know if I think I brought him some books. But in any case, this is an ancient, it aligns with ancient traditions of ancient Tibetan Buddhism. So Mashande gives him this scroll. There's some jibber jabber back and forth, and he's very sad, and I shouldn't call it jibber jabber. It's much more meaningful than that. And he's very sad to leave her. She says, "Don't worry, you'll see me soon enough. See me in a few weeks." And so he leaves this, and they do a space translation back to Transylvania from Tibet, and then they drive home. The Yidam, of course, disappears, and then they go back. They go back later, and when they go, they meet about 30 kids. They're supposed to go to a certain area, and they meet about 30 kids that are just sitting there. And they start talking to the kids, and the kids say, well, they all had dreams of Mashande. Mashande came into their dreams and told them to report to this spot. They didn't go as a group. They all came independently. They end up at this spot and say, somebody will come to guide you. And of course, the guides were Radu and his friends, Eleanor, and the Lama. And they walk up, and the Yidam appears. And then there's a huge, I guess what you call a bunch of negative energy in the skies. They have to kind of contend with that, which they do. And then Mashande appears coming out of a cave. She appears coming out of a cave, and basically Radu wakes up, and he said he's been out for 8 hours. They said he's been there for a long time, and they just let him experience Mashande. He had his own personal interaction with her. But he was like, if you would have saw him in the physical plane, he was like kind of just sitting there for 8 hours. And the kids had all gone home by that time. And that's kind of how the book ends. And because we're getting close on time, what I would say is when I went there in 2012, I was telling, or was it 2013? I was telling my guide from the previous year, and I was having this translated to his friends who he wanted me to meet when I had arrived there. I said what was going to happen this year for August 12th. And indeed, it was, I think, August 10th or 11th. I don't know what the date was here, but it was right in this realm. And I was telling him about my new book I was working on, The White Bat, and he got really excited. And he says, this girl saw a white bat in Mashande's cave. And I said, Mashande has a cave? Well, yeah, she has this cave. And I met the girl who saw the white bat. And I was eventually able to find out. So I was already titled my book "The White Bat," and then I would later be told that the white bat was the mascot of Mashande. So I'm like writing a wave here that is very fascinating, and of course, it's a very interesting sort of set of circumstances. But it all kind of takes place over long periods of time. It doesn't all happen in a short YouTube video.
Right.
That's a summarization of the second book, and of course, the fourth book actually expounds. Radu has to get the book translated, and the Lama helps him because it's written in some ancient Tibetan, script that he has to actually the Lama has to actually study. He helps him translate it, but it requires a little bit of study on his part.
Well, we will definitely pick this up with the third book, and hopefully we'll be able to also cover some aspects of the fourth. Do you have, well, I don't guess you've heard from Caesar or Radu, or do you know of, is there going to be any further books in the series, or I guess you're just kind of
Well, the fifth book
up
is
in the
The
air?
White Bat, which I just kind of,
Yeah.
sort of told you a little bit
Uh-huh.
about. But I haven't had contact with Radu or Caesar, but since we last spoke, I did have a contact with Mashande, and I wrote to my contact in Transylvania, who said, let's just say she appeared to me, and in the presence of my Qigong teacher. And I said, it was very quick, but I was unmistakable. And I wrote to my contact in Romania, told him about this, and I was sent back a picture of Eleanor, which is exactly what I would have expected to look like. Because I said meeting Mashande is better than meeting Eleanor, who's supposed to visit me at some point. So anyway, that was kind of neat, and because actually, when you see Mashande's at a much higher level than any of these characters, so she's
Right.
interesting to meet.
Well, hey, thanks, Peter. Appreciate it, and
Thank you.
we'll pick up next week.
Okay.
God bless all. Good night.
Themselves are not familiar with the work of Wilhelm Reich, who talked all about the skin, and the skin being a repository of orgone energy or life energy. So so anyway, you go into these insisted areas of charge within the individual, emotional charge, that would almost invariably trace back to something that might amount to like a past life that was holding one down in terms of their emotional responses to situations, to people. Now, all of what I'm saying here has absolutely nothing to do with the politics and or the alleged abuses that are known to occur in and around the subject. So I entered it at a time when I mean, you always heard about abuses. I would see, and sometimes it's not abuse per se, but it's misapplication of the procedures. And I went to, like, I was indoctrinated to look up every word in every course that I studied. So, like, I really had a certainty and a command of what the hell I was doing. And this gave me a very, I guess, what I call superior understanding of the subject. So when I see people saying this about it or that about it, and I'm not trying to tell anybody that it's the correct way to do things or it's for them. I'm just saying what I experienced, and I may not publicly reject what these people say because I don't have the time to waste, but they basically are offering their opinions. It's sort of like a boxer who gets beaten up and says, well, that, the rope-a-dope technique doesn't work, but he didn't know how to use the rope-a-dope technique. It didn't work for him. So, but this is a very booby trap subject. And, but I had experiences there. I was involved in the movement for 12 years, and from the ages of 18 to the age of 30. And then I was done with it forever. So that was like my formative years. And I must have studied 12,000 hours on the subject. And this is a discipline study. This is not breezy reading.
Did you what was there any particular reason as to why you left, or just
Yes.
decided to move on to anything
Well,
else?
one of the things is Christianity, just in terms of denominations. In Scientology, you don't have a lot of different denominations, but you have a lot of different individuals. And each one of them will have their own take. This is natural. This would apply to any subject, actually. But so you can read on the internet and what people say about it that are involved in it. And you can read about people that will say, oh, it's abusive, it's this. It's all in the eye of the beholder. And I can only speak to how I learned it. And I learned it, first off, and it's all important about how you define things. One of the most, and this is a preface to even talking about the subject, because in the subject of semantics and rhetoric, it's how are you defining the terms that you are using? So people, I see all the time, either comedians or critics saying, Scientologists believe this. And first off, belief does not have a place in Scientology. It's not really relevant if you're going to be strictly orthodox about the subject. It is about knowing. But in actual practice, people fake it. They don't know. They believe. They go along. So you're dealing with human fallibility when dealing with the subject. And you're dealing with the subject, of course, as Hubbard would define it, which was called, he had many different definitions for it. One was called knowing how to know, is the procedure of knowing, how do I know to know? How do I know this? Now that's going to be a very subjective process for an individual. It's also like lookingness. Lookingness was just one pure definition. Lookingness, like going out and looking, observation. Now, of course, Scientology is characterized by all sorts of a virtual infinity of different procedures and processes that are run on the mind. And there are many different approaches but basically the goal of it, when used intelligently, was to go into insisted areas of the mind that had literal charge. When I say literal charge, we're talking about emotional charge, but we're also talking about that would be impacted with some form of electromagnetic energy that would discharge on a galvanometer, which they call the E-meter. You'd see the discharge. It would go for wherever it's occurring in the vicinity of the individual, discharge through his skin and react on a meter. And this is most critics of Scientology, or even the Scientologists, it was given to mankind by Athena. But I found out that Athena was really, her earlier name was Antonia. And Antonia came from she was a blue queen of Atlantis who settled in the Ahagra region of the Sahara, which is Algeria today. And so this was a whole strain of synchronicities. And I was ready to write this, which was sort of symbolic of all of these synchronicities. And then I realized that I found out during the process of this experience that my parents, they were killed in an automobile accident in 1974. They were killed on the Adobe Los Olivos, the Adobe of the Olive, the Olivos family in California. And they were also buried on that land. they were killed and buried on that land in an automobile crash. And then I kept getting sent back there in my dreams, and I didn't know why. I wasn't dreaming of my parents. I was sent back to the area nearby. And finally, I realized in one of those dreams, I went back to where I had my early experiences in Scientology, out-of-body experiences. They all took place on Olive Drive. So I said, wow, I have to, the dreams were telling me I had to write about my Scientology experiences, which I did in the Montauk Book of the Dead. And this is a very long book. So I then had to write another book called the Montauk Book of the Living to explain all about the synchronicity of, Queen Antonia and the olive itself. And they're both, but it was like, I felt that I needed to explain my experiences with the Scientology movement so people could better understand how I got involved in all of this stuff. Because I never could have accomplished what I have without all of the, I guess, what you call learning process that occurred there for me, life learning process. So that's what the Montauk Book of the Dead is about.
Okay, excellent. Well,
Long answer.
yeah. Well, since you brought it up, would you mind elaborating just a little bit on your opinions and your relationship with Scientology and some of the facets of what you've learned and also maybe of what they believe?
Well, and I've said this frequently. There are millions of people who've dealt with Scientology on some level. Certainly that have studied it, but every one of them has a different opinion. And so to say, it's like, what is Christianity? You have so many different factions of Christianity.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. This will be the second in the series that we've been doing with Peter Moon, and I'm looking forward to further discourse. We've got still a lot to cover in the story of the Hall of Records located in the Buscegi Mountains in Romania. There's a 4-book set out from Skybooks that Peter has put out to cover all the details of this most fascinating story. And so we'll get into it here in just a short bit. Peter, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. And there's still much to talk about. But before we get into the discourse, would you give out your website contact and
Certainly.
And all that, where people can go find
the website is for books is skybooks.usa.com, skybooks.usa.com. You have to put the USA on the end of Skybooks. That's to purchase books. Informational website, and where you can also access the free video series Time Travel Theory Explained is digitalmontauk.com. digitalmontauk.com.
Excellent. Also, do you have any other books that are in the works now, or any other projects that you will...
I'm working on 2 books right now, which will be initially written. They've already begun, they're in progress, and they will be written chapter by chapter on my subscriber website, which will be released at the end of this month. And that's the 2 books. One is called Stardust and Initiation into Time. It could also be called, if I wished it to call it, would be appropriate, the Time Travel Primer, because it initiates you into time, understanding time from both a quantitative aspect and a qualitative aspect of time. The other book is a book about, has to do with L. Ron Hubbard. And I'm working, been working on that book a while. I've done one book on my experiences with Scientology per se in the Montauk Book of the Dead, but this book is going to go into, it's going to evaluate him in terms of the lowest common denominator of power. It's not really about, is he good, is he bad, is what he had to offer good or bad. It's about the lowest common denominator of power and how people can empower themselves. Those are the two books I'm working on now.
Interesting. When you say Montauk Book of the Dead, what's that about?
Well, it's a good question. I had a lot of synchronicity experiences surrounding got it tied from the Montauk Indians. It was about the olive. I was given a strange, what I call a quantum relic, which was basically a playbill from the new Montauk Theater. And Aleister Crowley's high priestess was actually performing at the new Montauk Theater. I didn't figure that out till later. And I was given this playbill of it. And it took me a year to find out that inside of this, there was a picture, two pictures of Jesus on the Mount of Olives. So I said, what the hell is this? And I did had a whole bunch of experiences of synchronicity with olives and the Mount of Olives as well. And in the midst of this research, I called a woman named Olive Farrow, who was the matriarch of the Montauk Indians. Of course, there were pyramids where the Montauk Project was once held in Montauk. And I sent her my book, Pyramids of Montauk. And she went to the hospital with a bleeding gallbladder on the day she received the book. She never recovered, she died. And I, said, wow. And I'm researching olives. I had this researching the meaning of olives, which is sacred to every religion, but where the Montauk Book of the Dead, fits in was actually, I found out, I'm going in many different directions here, but the olive was the most sacred substance or tree or gift of the gods in ancient Greece. And